Recording to the cloud.
All right, greetings. My name is Charlene Mohammed, and I am a member of IAYT. I also chaired the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Task Force for IAYT for the past 2 years before we had the development of the strategic plan as well as the DEI competencies. And I'm here with my wonderful friends and also members of IAYT, Danielle Atkinson and Dr. Marilyn Peppers Citizen, both CIAYTs as well as members of IAYT, who also supported the DEI competencies as well as the work within the organization itself. And so we're here today to discuss the competencies that were released to the membership as a way to begin to shape and forward the work that we're doing around diversity, equity, and inclusion in our own work as yoga therapists, within our member schools, and within the yoga therapy community itself. So welcome, Danielle, and welcome, Marilyn. And let's just jump right in here and talk about what were the organizational experiences within IAYT that led to the development of the competencies?
I'll go ahead and start. A timeline of IAYT's efforts toward creating a more diverse organization is available on the IAYT website. But in summary, IAYT has been working toward building a compassionate and nurturing culture where diversity, equity, inclusion, those practices are natural responses rather than an initiative. And so the organization acknowledges that certain groups in our society are treated inequitably and that biases exist within the organization. So the organization committed to ensuring that fairness and inclusion both were integrated in all activities, practices, policies, operations, programs, and that ultimately we're all striving toward an organization that's built on respect and compassion, and that it's an organization where members feel like they belong and they want to serve and be part of the community. And so a task force was formed, as you mentioned, Charlene, back in 2020. And part of that task force was to ensure that that deeper understanding of DEI was present in IAYT. It was also focused on fostering a more diverse organization and incorporating DEI in the strategic guidance. And the task force would have been the initial body that would delve into the crux of the core competencies for how it would be applicable to IAYT. And if Danielle wanted to add anything to that.
Yes, and thanks to the hard work over the past couple of years of the task force members, including yourself, Charlene, the board received recommendations, including the development of a longer standing, more pervasive committee that would continue the ongoing work of developing and reviewing DEI within the organization in conjunction with the board. And so that's the current place that we're landing in, is the work towards the development of a long-standing committee. And I really wanted to emphasize and reiterate what Marilyn was saying, that really this is the DEI competencies organizationally came out of the fact that we are a membership organization, right? Our members are vital and important into everything that we do and we undertake as an organization. And these competencies were developed to really support the education of membership, but also to engage in the work of yoga therapy, to be a piece of reflective practice that could be utilized for our membership to explore DEI in their ongoing personal and professional work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that that's really important that we understand that this is a framework, right? And it's not a definitive experience that we anticipate members or member schools to have, right? Or we say we don't do that checkbox sort of thing, but this really is a beginning conversation, a beginning of the journey, a beginning uh, exploration that we're having within ourselves as individual yoga therapists, within our own practices, as well as within our member schools. So with that, how can IAYT as an organization embrace these 5 particular DEI competencies? So as an organization, and then maybe we can talk about as individuals within the organization.
Well, I would start by saying that, as you mentioned, this current version of the competencies is a guideline. And it will have a different value for every person that reads it, right? The competencies were created to serve as a starting point for discussion and for self-study. So it's not a prescriptive document, but rather it's an invitation to engage in collaboration and communication, both applied at the individual and the collaborative level. And so one of IAYT's goals was to collaborate within the organization with partners, stakeholders, to cultivate an organization and to have a culture of belonging. But belonging is personal and it's determined by the individual. So this document was written from the perspective of individuals doing individual personal exploration. And so, like I said, everybody that reads it will find different values in it. But more than anything, to support whatever their needs are. And so ultimately, the document will be refined as the discussions progress.
And yeah, I would say to remember to read the entirety of the document. I know there's this natural instinct to gravitate towards reading the competencies and saying, okay, I got this. I understand that these exist. And to Marilyn's point, don't see them as a checklist, but there's other elements to the document that I think would be supportive. And so I would guide people to look at the section that starts on page 7. And that's really where we understand that this is a commitment. This is a piece of a larger commitment to ongoing work that us organizationally we're doing as a membership organization. So I sit in that weird position where I'm both a member but also work as staff. But I'm a member first, and so I think remembering that this is a piece of a larger commitment. It's one step to guide that commitment, and that section also includes some of the guiding principles that were used and shaped by the work being done by the task force, the board, the DEI work that had been done over the past few years. And so I think that that hopefully people will go beyond just reading the first few pages and the list of competencies and actually start diving into what Marilyn's pointing out, this work. How can I apply this as an organization, as a member of this organization, but also as an individual within the sphere of yoga therapy, both personally and professionally?
Excellent. And it always begins with self too, right? The work begins with each of us as an individual to do our own work before we can ultimately come into a group, a membership, an organization, and do the work there. So I like the fact that you're pointing us back to doing our own individual work first, because it ultimately starts right there. That's how change begins, right? Within each of us as an individual before we can point our fingers at an organization or society in and of itself. So let's look at what is the best manner or strategies for we IAYT members. What's the best way that we can utilize these DEI competency framework? You already sort of talked about it, but maybe we can have some more specific steps that you might want to suggest for us as individual members in using this framework.
Well, Charlene and Danielle, you've reiterated it. It goes back to self-study. So consider the competencies as a lens, something to consider as we do our own individual self-study. So it's acknowledging that our own personal experiences and understandings of culture, bias, compassion, social justice, all of that, it is different for each one of us, and that it impacts how we move through life and how we interact in our environments. And so as an example, when considering cultural competency, each of us should be open to difference, right? We should be flexible, be and demonstrate humility. And really, it's just all aspects of our practices of yoga.
I think that's a really important lens to look at it from is this is part of our work. It's not an adjunct to, it's not separate to the work we do as yoga therapists. We apply these same principles of self-study, of satya, of truthfulness, of all of the work that we do with ourselves, on ourselves, and with our clients. I think that this is something that we have to integrate and embed within that framework as well. I'm a very tangible, document-driven person, so I would suggest that people take a look at, say, page 9 of the document, and there's a table that gives us some guidelines on how to explore it, how to apply the application of these principles to the self operationally, as within the organization, but also as professional yoga therapists, because many of our members are professional members, as well as with the broader community. I think that's something we can look at. For example, I think we need to really read through and reflect on them, and to Marilyn's point, be honest with ourselves in that reflective process and seek guidance in a lot of this. None of us are experts here. We're all learning, and we're all hopefully going to grow as a community, and being able to identify where we reside on the spectrum of learning, where our gaps may be, can support us in growing and directing our own learning, right? I think we also have to be responsible and take responsibility for seeking out opportunities and further learning. On page 11, there's actually a spectrum, so that we, again, as an educator, I'm always like, give me the rubric, and how can I see this rubric? So, and part of the design of this was making sure and re-emphasizing that this is not the checklist. This is a spectrum. We all grow and we shift, and we measure our growth and successes within our own journey. And there's areas as we move from ready or responding to into being able to support our, each other and our communities with these skills. I also feel that it also helps to reveal other gaps and areas that we can then continue to evolve. And my hope is always that we can do that in community, that we don't see ourselves as alone in this, but this is a way to connect each other as a community of yoga therapists, to be able to identify where we can continue to grow, and also to keep us as an organization accountable for that continued and ongoing growth.
And you segue right into my next sort of question or comment here, which is about, as we're growing yoga therapists, as yoga therapy schools, right? So we're building community and sharing this wonderful gift of yoga therapy with other yoga teachers striving to be yoga therapists. So what is it? How can member schools begin to utilize this competency framework within the context of their own curriculum, in the context of changing or enhancing the culture within their own schools? What might you think?
Schools are in a unique position. They're an organization within an organization. Right. So the competencies, and Danielle referenced this, but it was called the spheres of influence. I think that was on page 11, I think it was. But this section addresses how the competencies are are put into action within us individually, within groups, and as such within schools, within committees or volunteer groups. So the schools can consider how they function as organizations, how each member of their staff and their faculty interact personally and as a group with each other, and then how they interact with their students and how they support their students. So a lot of different perspectives, the same lens, but just from different perspectives. So as an example, something like managing conversations and addressing potential conflicts and not being afraid of conflicts, as part of life. And as we study yoga, we prepare ourselves to deal with that. And supporting learning and developing team members, still using these competencies and philosophies as a lens for addressing these different opportunities that come up.
Absolutely.
And I mean, with my hat from accreditation, I would like to hope that, one of the many benefits of being a member of this organization and being a member school in this organization is access to resources, right? We have journals, we have a code of ethics, we have a scope of practice. This is another support for curriculum development. So I know in my experience with accreditation, many programs are including lessons on the scope of practice, of the code of ethics, of how to access the journal, looking through research in the journal. And my hope is that they'll see this as a valuable tool to incorporate in the education of future yoga therapists, but also to do that work on themselves as educators, right? As the educators of future yoga therapists, where do we sit in this sphere? How are we doing that self-reflective work as a school, not just as individuals within that framework, but how can we then use this as a reflective process? Ideally, I would love to see, schools engaging in really rich conversations with their students, because again, we don't see what we don't see. We don't know what we don't know. And being able to engage in conversations, rich conversations, reflective practices with our students, I feel like would be highly beneficial into the ongoing development of this work and communities within the schools that we have within your IAYT.
Yeah, it sounds like we need to apply our own yoga therapy within ourselves and within the settings that we're sitting, for sure. And thank you so much for your time. And what I think I got the most out of my conversation with you today is that this is a framework. And like any framework, it's sitting on a foundation. And that foundation starts with self. So if we begin that self-work, and if you have no idea around what is this whole concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion, what does it mean? Where do I begin? That these competencies that IAYT is offering is the beginning of that conversation. So thank you all for your time.